Okay, then.
Hip, Zorn, Strux.
These are... So...
Hey, you know what? ISL. Real. The island is...
I can't believe it. I can't believe somebody actually found the island. Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson.
Maybe it's not a sum.
Treasure Island, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Was going fast. Is he a runner?
What of his last... Another author. Gulliver. Okay, wait.
Never found Mysterious Island because I haven't used the other 2 books. Yeah, but these are different than Verne's. I don't get it.
You know what I did in the Navy, Sean?
No.
For code breaking.
Perfect. Yeah, joke all you want.
Yeah, I will, and you're going to be here to listen to it. Well, halfway around the world and meet up with some lunatic who's messing. How would you know he said that? Look, stop.
But you need to just focus on running your construction company and...
Consider what it means that this film even exists. Journey 2 is a sequel to 2008's Journey to the Center of the Earth. But here's what's strange. It completely replaces the father figure from that first film. Brendan Fraser played Sean's uncle, the man who took him on the original adventure. 4 years later, he's gone mentioned once in dialogue, then forgotten. Instead, we get Hank, the new stepfather, starting from scratch to earn Sean's respect. The franchise itself embodies the absent father pattern. The adventurer from the first film has disappeared, and now someone else has to do the unglamorous work of being present. This isn't a bug in the sequel's premise. It's the premise making the thesis visible. Adventure fathers are interchangeable precisely because their value lies in the quest, not the relationship. Fraser's character served his narrative function, won adventure, and exited. Hank has to prove himself all over again because presence, the day-to-day reality of fatherhood, doesn't accumulate mythology the way adventure does. You don't get credit for being there yesterday. You have to re-earn it every morning. The film even lampshades this through Alexander's backstory. Michael Caine's character didn't just abandon his family once for one expedition. He's been gone for decades, serially choosing exploration over connection. And yet, Sean's entire emotional life revolves around finding him, decoding his messages, continuing his work. The grandfather who was never there commands more devotion than the stepfather who's there every day. This isn't presented as pathology. It's treated as understandable, even noble. Of course Sean wants to find his grandfather. He's a legendary Vernian explorer. But step back from the adventure genre's value system for one moment and look at the actual behavior. A teenage boy ignores his mother's loving husband to chase after her absent father who chose treasure hunting over raising his daughter. We've been so conditioned by quest narratives that this seems heroic rather than what it actually is. A kid who's internalized the idea that real fathers are somewhere else, doing something more important. Journey 2 is not unaware of this problem. Its entire second act is structured around Hank, trying to prove his worth using adventure father metrics, physical courage, protective strength, specialized knowledge. The infamous peck pop scene where Johnson bounces his pectoral muscles to distract a giant lizard is widely mocked as the film's dumbest moment. It's actually the film's most honest. Watch Hank's face in that scene. He's humiliated, desperately throwing out every masculine signifier he can perform to stay relevant in his stepson's eyes. He's competing with a grandfather whose very absence has granted him mythological status, and Hank's losing because presence can't compete with mythology. The film wants you to cringe at this scene. Not because it's silly, though it is, but because it's revealing the degradation inherent in making present fathers prove themselves against absent ones. Hank shouldn't have to bounce his pecs. He should be valued for the years of showing up, the bail money, the decoded messages, the willingness to fly to the South Pacific because his stepson needs him. But the film's structure, borrowed from Verne, from every adventure story that's taught us what heroism looks like, doesn't have a metric for measuring that kind of value. So Hank bounces his pecs, and audiences laugh, and nobody notices they're watching a stepdad debase himself because we've built a culture where that's what present fathers have to do to compete with absent legends. This is what Journey 2 is actually about. Not treasure or islands or grandfather reunions, but the stories we tell about which men matter and why. The film is trapped inside those stories, unable to fully escape their gravity, but aware enough to show you the bars of the cage. The question this essay will answer is, why did nobody see it? The proof isn't hidden. It's structural, embedded in every scene where the film places these two father figures in proximity and then shows us through composition, through dialogue, through who gets validated, which one the narrative privileges. Let me show you what everyone overlooks. The visibility problem. Who gets framed as father? Start with the film's opening sequence before we even reach the island. John Anderson breaks into a satellite relay station in the middle of the night, trespassing on government property to intercept a transmission he believes is from his missing grandfather. He's caught within minutes. The police call his parents. Here's what arrives: Hank Parsons, alone at 2 a.m., to a police station in California. Not Sean's mother, Liz Hank. The film makes a specific choice to have the stepfather be the one who shows up, who handles the legal consequences, who signs the paperwork. This is the unglamorous infrastructure of fatherhood: midnight calls, apologies to annoyed police officers, the management of adolescent consequences. Hank doesn't get a dramatic entrance. He arrives already tired, wearing civilian clothes, to once again be the responsible adult cleaning up after other men's adventures. Sean's response? Not gratitude, not recognition. He immediately starts explaining the transmission to Hank, demanding they decode it together, turning Hank into an instrumental father, someone useful for his skills, not valued for his presence. Watch the scenes blocking: Sean facing his computer screen, Hank standing behind him, literally backgrounded. The film's visual language tells you who commands the space. Now watch what happens when Hank tries to parent. He sees the Jules Verne books, the obsessive charts on Sean's wall, the years of searching for a grandfather who chose not to be found. Hank makes a reasonable observation. You know Alexander doesn't want to be found, right? He's trying to protect his stepson from chasing a fantasy. The film frames this as the enemy of adventure. Sean bristles, shuts down. The audience is positioned to see Hank as the obstacle, the man who doesn't understand, who represents boring reality. But Hank's right. Alexander has chosen not to be found. He's been radio silent for years, content to let his family believe he's dead or indifferent. The transmission Sean intercepts isn't Alexander reaching out to his abandoned daughter or checking on his grandson. It's Alexander broadcasting coordinates to the mysterious island, sending a message to the world. Sean just happens to be listening. The grandfather isn't choosing connection. The grandson is manufacturing it. The film knows this. It shows us Hank recognizing this. Then it structures the entire narrative around proving Hank wrong for saying it out loud. Because adventure stories don't reward men who point out that the quest is emotionally destructive. They reward men who pack the bags and say, "Let's go," which is what Hank does. Against his own judgment, recognizing that Sean will chase this with or without him, Hank books flights to Palau, arranges for a helicopter tour guide, takes time off work, and throws himself into enabling the very fantasy he knows is unhealthy. This is love. Imperfect, compromised love. The willingness to be wrong if being right means losing your kid. The film never once acknowledges this as heroic. Hank's capitulation is treated as the baseline requirement to be tolerated. He's being allowed to participate in Sean's real relationship, which is with the absent grandfather. The decoding scene, whose knowledge matters. Here's a moment everyone forgets. Hank is the one who cracks Alexander's code. Sean has been obsessing over these transmissions for months, maybe years. He's a 17-year-old kid with internet access and inherited intelligence, and he can't break his grandfather's encryption. Enter Hank, who spent years in the Navy operating communication systems. He looks at the signal pattern for approximately 90 seconds and says, "That's a were-you-era military code. Simple substitution cipher. I can break this." And he does. Within minutes, Hank's practical, unglamorous military experience solves the romantic puzzle that's been consuming Sean's adolescence. Sean's reaction, mild appreciation, immediately refocused on what the decoded message reveals. The film doesn't linger on Hank's competence. It doesn't allow Sean a moment of recognition that his stepfather possesses deep knowledge, that there are forms of intelligence beyond adventurer mystique. The code breaking is treated as mechanical, utilitarian. Hank performed a function. Now we can return to the important business of worshiping Alexander's clues. Contrast this with every scene involving Alexander's knowledge. When they finally reach the island and find the grandfather's camp, Sean treats each object like a religious artifact. Alexander's journals, his charts, his equipment, all handled with reverence. The grandfather's knowledge is framed as mystical, hard-won through impossible experiences. Hank's knowledge is framed as procedural, the boring stuff you learn in the military. But remove the adventure genre's framing, and what do you actually see? Alexander's knowledge got him stranded on an island for years, isolated from everyone he loved, waiting for rescue he didn't seek. Hank's knowledge reunites families, solves problems, enables connection. One man's expertise leads to abandonment, the other's leads to presence. The film privileges the former every single time. Watch the sequence where they're preparing for the journey to Palau. Hank is making practical arrangements, booking the helicopter, securing equipment, handling logistics. Sean is reading Vernean literature, preparing for the mythological experience. The film gives us montage shots of Sean studying, maps and books and coordinates, scored with adventurous music. Hank's preparation happens off-screen or in brief, unscored moments. The practical work of making adventure possible is treated as non-cinematic. Only the romance of anticipation gets the movie moment treatment. This is how adventure narratives erase maintenance labor. They show you the departure and the discovery, cutting out the 1,000 unglamorous tasks that enable both. Hank performs those tasks constantly. He's basically the film's infrastructure, but they don't register as heroic because heroism in adventure's grammar means transcending the practical rather than mastering it. The first meeting, iconography as argument. When they finally find Alexander, the film makes its clearest visual argument for which father matters. The grandfather is standing in front of his camp makeshift shelter, built from salvaged materials, decades of survival made visible in the landscape around him. Michael Caine, backlit by golden late afternoon sun, dressed in weathered explorer gear that somehow looks dignified rather than desperate. The film gives him a low-angle shot, the camera tilted up slightly, granting him stature. The background is the island itself, giant ferns, impossible geography, the visual manifestation of wonder. Alexander gets an entrance, a reveal, a moment. Now watch where Hank is in this shot, to the side, in medium framing, no dramatic lighting. He's present, but compositionally backgrounded. The camera is interested in Sean's reaction to Alexander and Alexander's reaction to Sean. Hank is the witness to their reunion, not a participant in the emotional geometry. Kualana, their helicopter pilot, gets more visual attention in this sequence than Hank does, because Kualana's meeting Alexander for the first time. Hank is just there. The stepfather who made this reunion possible, reduced to an extra in someone else's moment. What follows is even more revealing. Alexander and Sean embrace, then immediately start talking about Vernian texts. The books, the codes, the proof that 3 literary islands, Mysterious Island, Treasure Island, Atlantis, occupy the same coordinates. Its grandfather and grandson united by shared mythology, speaking a language of adventure that excludes everyone else. Kualana and Gabato, her father, their pilot, are confused but charmed. Hank is watching his stepson connect with a man who abandoned his family using a vocabulary of wonder that Hank doesn't speak. The film presents this as beautiful. Reunification, hereditary connection, the passing of knowledge across generations. And on the surface, it is. Michael Caine and Josh Hutcherson have genuine chemistry in these scenes. The actors sell the relationship. But look at what the film is actually validating. A kid getting more emotional satisfaction from 10 minutes with his absent grandfather than from years with his present stepfather. And not just satisfaction, belonging. Sean lights up around Alexander in a way he never does with Hank, because Alexander offers something Hank can't. Participation in a mythology where fathers are most valuable when they're pursuing something more important than you. Alexander's first words to Sean, after decades of abandonment, after choosing island exploration over knowing his grandson, "You decoded my message. I knew you would. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I've missed you. Not even, I should have contacted your mother." Just immediate validation that Sean was right to chase him, right to break laws and drag his stepfather across the Pacific. The film frames this as Alexander having faith in Sean, but it's actually Alexander drafting Sean into the same value system that made him abandon his family in the first place. The belief that the quest justifies everything. Alexander's first act as a grandfather is to confirm that Sean was correct to prioritize adventure over ordinary life. No wonder Hank can't compete. The peck pop, masculine degradation as comedy. Everyone remembers the scene where The Rock bounces his pectoral muscles to distract a giant lizard. It's been memed, mocked, cited as evidence of the film's stupidity. Remember when Dwayne Johnson did the peck thing in that dumb island movie? Here's what that scene actually is. A stepfather so desperate to remain relevant in his son's eyes that he debases himself, turning his body into a circus act because it's the only form of value the situation allows him. They're trapped. A massive lizard is blocking their path, and the group is trying to figure out how to distract it. Gabato suggests that his daughter Kailani could be the distraction. She's young, attractive, and the lizard might be interested. Before anyone can object to this insane plan, Hank volunteers himself. "I'll do it." Everyone looks at him. The grandfather, the teenage stepson, the other adults. Hank is the largest, most physically imposing person in the group. He's got the body of an action star because he's being played by Dwayne Johnson at peak physicality. But nobody believes he can be the distraction because nothing in the adventure so far has framed Hank as impressive. He's been the practical one, the cautious one, the guy who handles logistics. Alexander has been the impressive one, the legendary explorer, the man who knows the island's secrets. So Hank strips off his shirt and starts bouncing his pecs. And yes, it's absurd. The film plays it for comedy. But watch Hank's face during this scene. Johnson's performance underneath the joke. He looks humiliated, desperate. He's performing masculinity as spectacle because he's realized that his stepson values spectacular masculinity, Alexander's effortless adventurer cool over functional masculinity, Hank's provider stability. The lizard is distracted. The plan works. They escape. And Sean doesn't say thank you or that was brave or acknowledge that his stepfather just risked his life in a degrading way to protect him. He's embarrassed by Hank, embarrassed that his stepfather had to do something so ridiculous when presumably Alexander would have handled it with more dignity. But Alexander's dignity comes from never being tested like this. He's had years to mythologize himself on this island to become the story he tells about surviving impossible odds. Hank has 90 minutes of runtime to prove his worth under constant comparison to a legend, and the only tools the genre gives him are adventure hero tools, physical prowess, protective violence, spectacular masculinity. The peck-popping scene is Hank trying to speak Alexander's language and realizing he doesn't have the vocabulary. It's painful. The film knows it's painful. That's why it plays as comedy. We laugh to escape the discomfort of watching a good man realize that being good isn't enough if you're not also mythological. Later, there's a throwaway line where Alexander compliments Hank on the lizard distraction, brilliant improvisation. It's the first and only time the grandfather acknowledges the stepfather's contribution. And it's condescending, the master adventurer praising the novice's clever trick. Hank nods, takes the compliment, and the film moves on. Neither of them notices that improvisation is all Hank's been doing since he met Sean, improvising fatherhood, improvising adventure, improvising his way into a role he never auditioned for, trying to earn a place in a story that was written before he arrived. The abandonment confession, what gets forgiven? Midway through the film, Alexander admits the truth. He chose exploration over his family. His daughter, Sean's mother, grew up without him because he was chasing Vernian mythology. He wasn't kidnapped, wasn't lost, wasn't prevented from returning. He chose the island. This is presented as a tragic flaw. Alexander's voice breaks slightly when he talks about missing his daughter's childhood. Michael Caine plays it with genuine regret. The film wants you to feel the weight of his sacrifice, the cost of his obsession. But watch what the film does with this confession. It forgives him immediately. Sean's response is basically, "But you discovered the impossible. You proved Verne was right." The grandson absolves the grandfather because the adventure was worth it. The years of abandonment, the damage to his mother, the cascade of absence that shaped Sean's entire childhood, all forgiven because Alexander achieved something extraordinary. Now imagine if Hank had abandoned a family. Imagine if the film revealed that Hank had a daughter from a previous relationship whom he hadn't seen in 20 years because he was busy being, what? A construction foreman? A Navy communications specialist? There is no version of ordinary work that would justify absence the way adventure does. Hank would be a deadbeat dad. Alexander is a tragic hero. This is the double standard the film exposes even as it perpetuates it. We forgive adventurer fathers for abandonment because we've structured our narratives to treat their quests as transcendent. We don't forgive ordinary fathers for absence because their work doesn't generate mythology. Alexander's confession scene should be the moment where Sean realizes his grandfather isn't a hero, he's a cautionary tale. Instead, it deepens Sean's devotion. He's moved by his grandfather's honesty, impressed by his accomplishments, eager to continue his work. The abandonment becomes proof of commitment. Alexander loved the island enough to give up everything for it. That's not pathology to Sean, that's passion. Hank watches this exchange, says nothing. What could he say? He spent years showing up for Sean, and it's earned him tolerance. Alexander abandoned his family for decades, and it's earned him worship. The film has just demonstrated that presence cannot compete with mythological absence, and Hank knows it. The scene ends with them moving forward together, grandfather, stepfather, grandson, united in shared mission. But the emotional hierarchy has been established. When Sean needs wisdom, he turns to Alexander. When he needs functionality, he uses Hank. One is the spiritual father, the other is the maintenance father. Guess which one gets loved and which one gets deployed? The Nautilus moment. Who gets credit for saving the day? The island is sinking. They have minutes to escape, and their helicopter is destroyed. Everyone's going to die unless they find another way off the island. It's Hank who remembers the old submarine they passed earlier, half buried in volcanic rock. It's Hank who suggests they dig it out and attempt to repair it. It's Hank's military engineering knowledge that makes the plan possible. But it's Alexander who knew the submarine was there in the first place. Watch how the film structures this revelation. When Hank proposes using the submarine, Alexander smiles, that knowing, professorial smile, and says, "The Nautilus. Captain Nemo's submarine. He's been on this island for years. He knew this asset existed. He presumably explored it, cataloged it, understood its potential. But he never mentioned it, never proposed it as an escape option, because he wasn't ready to leave yet." Think about that. Alexander had a potential exit strategy and didn't use it because the adventure wasn't finished. He was willing to risk dying on the island rather than leave before he'd fully explored it. And when someone else suggests the submarine as salvation, his response is basically, "Oh yes, I'm familiar with that." Casual, confident, the legendary explorer who knew the way out all along. The film treats this as impressive. Alexander's depth of knowledge, his familiarity with the impossible. But it's actually a damning character detail. He prioritized completion of his exploration over survival, over the possibility of reconnecting with his family. If Sean hadn't arrived to force his rescue, Alexander might have stayed until the island sank, taking him with it. He would have chosen death by adventure over life with his daughter. And somehow, impossibly, this makes Sean revere him more. Meanwhile, Hank's doing the actual work. He's organizing the dig, engineering the repairs, coordinating the escape. He's the reason they survive. But because Alexander knew about the Nautilus first, because the grandfather's knowledge enabled Hank's solution, the credit disperses. Alexander provided the information, Hank just implemented it. This is maintenance labor's eternal problem. It's visible only when it fails. When it succeeds, we credit the people who created the conditions for success, not the people who did the succeeding. Alexander gets credit for knowing about the submarine. Hank gets expected to make it work. There's a moment during the repair sequence where Sean and Alexander are discussing Verne's descriptions of the Nautilus, comparing the fictional specifications to the real vessel they're excavating, bonding over literature while Hank rewires electrical systems. The film crosscuts between these two modes, grandfather and grandson doing intellectual work, identifying parts, discussing history, and stepfather doing physical work, actually repairing the mechanism. The film doesn't frame this as unfair distribution of labor. It frames it as natural specialization. Alexander and Sean share the knowledge work because they share the mythology. Hank does the technical work because that's his role. The functional father, the man who makes things work. But remove the adventure framing, and what you see is an elderly man and a teenager talking about books while a stepfather literally saves their lives with his hands. One of these contributions is more valuable than the other, but the film can't admit which. The inheritance, what gets passed down? The film's final scene takes place after they've returned to civilization, survived the impossible, and achieved the bonding the narrative promised. Sean has accepted Hank. Alexander has reconnected with his daughter. Everyone's together. The adventure worked. It forged the family that reality couldn't. And then Alexander gives Sean a gift, another Jules Verne novel, From the Earth to the Moon, with coordinates hidden in the text. Everyone in the scene treats this as sweet. A grandfather giving his grandson a book, sharing the passion that defined his life, inviting him into the tradition of Vernean exploration. It's framed as generational connection, the passing of hereditary knowledge. But look at what's actually happening. Alexander is recruiting Sean into the same ideology that made him abandon his family. He's gifting his grandson another quest, another reason to prioritize adventure over presence, another transmission to decode that will pull Sean away from ordinary life. The cycle is not ending. It's being perpetuated, with Sean as the next generation of adventurer sons who will value pursuit over stability. Sean accepts the book with excitement, immediately starts looking for the hidden coordinates. His mother, Liz, and Hank exchange a glance. Here we go again. The film plays it as comedy, the resigned acceptance of Sean's adventurous nature. But it's actually showing you the moment where Alexander successfully transfers his values to the next generation, and nobody has the vocabulary to object. Hank doesn't say, maybe we could take a break from nearly dying on impossible islands. He doesn't suggest that Sean might want to finish high school or apply to colleges or do any of the ordinary things that ordinary fathers value, because the film has already established that objecting to adventure makes you the enemy. Hank has learned his lesson. To be accepted, he has to enable the mythology, not challenge it, so he smiles, accepts that his stepson will keep chasing absent men and distant islands. The film ends with the promise of another adventure, another journey, another opportunity for Sean to choose quest over stability. Alexander has won, not just Sean's forgiveness, but his future. The absent grandfather gets to shape the grandson's trajectory more than the present stepfather does, because he's offering something Hank can't: escape from the ordinary into the extraordinary. The film's final shot is the family together. Liz, Hank, Sean, and Alexander framed as unity and healing. But look at the visual composition. Alexander and Sean are leaning toward each other, already discussing the next adventure. Liz and Hank are watching them, slightly separate, the adults who manage the consequences of other people's quests. This is the film's most honest image. Present parents on one side, adventure seekers on the other, and a gulf between them that love bridges but never closes. The family is reunited, but the value system that privileges absence over presence remains intact. Alexander abandons his family for decades and gets rewarded with his grandson's devotion and another adventure. Hank shows up every day and gets rewarded with being tolerated. The visual grammar, how the frame tells you who matters throughout the film. Watch what cinematographer David Tattersall does with lighting. Every scene set on the island is shot in golden hour warmth, that magic light photographers chase, the glow that makes everything look romantic and possible. The island itself is lit like a dream, like the platonic ideal of adventure. Every scene set in civilization, the mainland, Sean's home, the police station is lit flat. Institutional fluorescence, overcast daylight, the harsh clarity of ordinary life. These scenes look like reality television compared to the island's cinematic beauty. The film is showing you its preference. Adventure is aesthetically privileged, ordinary life is visually punished. When Hank exists in mainland spaces, he's lit like a sitcom dad. When he exists on the island, he starts to glow too, but only because he's entering Alexander's territory, playing by adventure rules. Michael Caine, meanwhile, carries 80 years of cinematic iconography into every scene. He's been John le Carré's spy master, Batman's butler, Harry Palmer, Jack Carter. He is British adventure cinema. The film can't escape his gravitational field. When Caine is on screen, the genre itself is present, and every adventure narrative you've ever absorbed is activated. Dwayne Johnson is fighting that. He's playing against his action hero persona, deliberately making himself smaller, more domestic, less physically dominant than his other roles. It's an interesting performance choice, Johnson trying to be a character actor in a spectacle film, but the movie keeps undermining him, putting him in situations where he has to perform spectacular masculinity, the peck bounce, the action sequences, even though his character is trying to establish value through presence rather than prowess. The film's editing patterns tell the same story. Watch the rhythm of shot-to-shot cutting when Alexander is speaking versus when Hank is speaking. Alexander gets longer takes, more static camera, the visual language of wisdom and authority. Hank gets shorter takes, more camera movement, the visual language of practicality and function. These aren't accidents. Tattersall and editor David Rennie are using film grammar to tell you who the narrative considers important. And consistently, relentlessly, the grammar privileges the absent father over the present one. What the island means. The unsustainable myth. The mysterious island rises from the ocean every 70 years, offers a brief window of impossible wonders, then sinks back into the depths. Alexander has been living on it for years, studying it, documenting it, refusing to leave until he's cataloged every impossible creature and verified every Vernian detail. The island sinking isn't just a ticking clock plot device. It's the film making its thesis material. The adventure cannot sustain itself. You can visit wonder, but you cannot build a life there. Anyone who tries drowns. Alexander tried. He's been living on borrowed time, on ground that was always going to collapse beneath him. And when it finally does, when the island begins its inevitable descent, Alexander still doesn't want to leave. He's grabbing samples, taking final measurements, squeezing every last moment of discovery from his sinking paradise. Sean has to physically drag him toward the submarine. This is addiction logic. The addict who can't leave the drug even as it kills him. The film is showing you, not telling you, showing you that adventure as a life philosophy is literally unsustainable. You will sink with it if you don't let go. But the film can't commit to this realization, because letting go of adventure means letting go of the genre itself, and Journey 2 is an adventure film. It can show you the cage, but it can't open the door, because there's no movie beyond that door. There's just ordinary life, and ordinary life isn't cinematic. So the island sinks, taking the adventure with it, and everyone escapes. And then, immediately, in the final scene, Alexander offers the next adventure. The mythology survives the collapse of its physical manifestation. This is how ideologies persist, not by being true, but by being adaptable. The island can sink. The adventure continues. Hank survives by becoming an adventurer himself. He proves his worth by being able to function in adventure space, by competing on Alexander's terms. The film cannot imagine him being valued for what he was before, the stable, present, functional father. He has to transform into something closer to Alexander to deserve his place in Sean's life. This is the tragedy the film can diagnose but not cure. It knows Hank should be enough. It knows presence should matter more than mythology. But it's trapped inside narrative structures that have spent centuries teaching us otherwise. So it does what it can, it shows you the trap, lights it clearly, makes the bars visible. Then it leaves you inside because it doesn't know how to open the lock. Let me address the obvious objections head on. Because if you've read this far, you're probably thinking one of three things. I'm overthinking a children's movie. I'm ignoring the actual reconciliation that happens. Or I'm being unfair to a film that clearly demonstrates growth and healing. These are legitimate criticisms. Let me take them seriously. Counter-argument. 1. It's just a kid's movie. You're overthinking it. The most common dismissal, Journey 2, is a family adventure designed to entertain children for 90 minutes. It's not a philosophical treatise on fatherhood. Analyzing it as cultural criticism is like dissecting a happy meal. You're bringing academic artillery to a target that never claimed to be substantial. There's merit here. Brad Peyton didn't set out to make a Bergman film about masculine ideology. The production notes emphasize fun, spectacle, family-friendly entertainment. The film was released in 3D to capitalize on Avatar's technological moment. Its primary goal was box office returns from the family demographic, not cultural commentary. But here's what this objection overlooks. Children's media is where we teach cultural values most effectively, precisely because we don't think we're teaching anything. When we dismiss a film as just for kids, we stop examining the lessons embedded in its structure. We assume the lack of self-seriousness means lack of consequence. This is backwards. Journey 2 reaches kids at the exact developmental moment when they're forming ideas about what fathers should be, what masculinity looks like, what kinds of men deserve respect. The film teaches them that adventure justifies absence, that present fathers have to prove themselves against absent legends, that ordinary stability is less valuable than extraordinary pursuit. It teaches these lessons through structure and framing, not through dialogue or explicit moralizing, which makes them more powerful, not less. The just a kids movie defense actually strengthens my thesis. If this were a prestige drama about fatherhood, we'd scrutinize every choice. Because it's a family adventure, we let it bypass our critical faculties and deliver its ideology directly to the audience most vulnerable to it. Children watching this film learn what the culture values in fathers. And what the culture values, the film shows us clearly: mythology over maintenance, quest over presence, Alexander over Hank. Moreover, saying it's just entertainment doesn't explain why the film makes the specific choices it does. Why include the peck-popping scene at all? Why have Hank decode the message if you're not going to validate his competence? Why cast Dwayne Johnson against type, making him smaller and more domestic, if the film doesn't care about these dynamics? The structural choices reveal intentionality, even if that intention is unconscious. The film is arguing with itself about fatherhood, whether it means to or not. So yes, it's a kids' movie. That makes the analysis more important, not less relevant. Counterargument. 2. But Hank and Sean do reconcile. The arc works. This is the stronger objection. The film's entire second and third acts are structured around Hank and Sean bonding. They work together to solve problems, they have vulnerable conversations, they risk their lives for each other. By the end, Sean explicitly tells Hank he's grateful, he's accepted him as family, he no longer resents the marriage. The reconciliation happens. The stepfather wins the stepson's love. Isn't that exactly the present father validation I claim the film denies? On the surface, absolutely. The film delivers the emotional resolution it promises. Josh Hutcherson and Dwayne Johnson sell the relationship evolution. There are genuine moments of connection. The scene where Hank admits he's scared, the moment when Sean acknowledges Hank's bravery, the final embrace where Sean calls him dad for the first time. But look at the terms of that reconciliation. Sean doesn't accept Hank because he learns to value stability, presence, or domestic masculinity. He accepts Hank because Hank proves he can be adventurous. The bonding happens entirely within adventure space, under adventure conditions, using adventure metrics of value. Every vulnerable conversation happens on the island during crisis. Every moment of Hank proving his worth involves physical courage, specialized knowledge, or protective action, all adventure hero qualities. Sean never has a scene where he thinks, Hank has been showing up for me every day for years, and that's actually more impressive than one adventure. The film cannot imagine reconciliation outside the framework that privileges Alexander's model. Watch the emotional climax of their relationship. It's when Hank throws Sean to safety as the island collapses, risking his own life to save his stepson. This is spectacular sacrifice, adventure hero behavior. It's also the only language Sean's been taught to understand as proof of love. Hank has been sacrificing for Sean since before the film started, sacrificing his time, his authority, his dignity. But none of that registered as love until it happened on a sinking island during an action sequence. The reconciliation is real, but it's a reconciliation that requires Hank to become more like Alexander, not for Sean to accept Hank as he already was. The present father gains value by becoming an absent one, entering mythological space and proving himself through quest. That's not a validation of Hank's model of fatherhood. It's a validation of Alexander's model, with Hank learning to perform it. Furthermore, look at what happens after the reconciliation. Alexander is still positioned as the knowledge keeper, the adventure enabler, the mythological figure. He's the one who gets to offer the next quest. Hank may have won Sean's acceptance, but he hasn't displaced Alexander as the aspirational father. He's been admitted into the family structure, but not at the top of the hierarchy. The film gives you a happy ending. I'm not disputing that. What I'm arguing is that the happiness is achieved through Sean learning to appreciate Hank for adventure father qualities, not learning that present father qualities have different, equally valid value. The reconciliation happens entirely on Alexander's terms. That's not synthesis, it's capitulation. Counter-argument. 3. Alexander learns his lesson. He admits his mistake. The film explicitly addresses Alexander's abandonment. Michael Caine delivers a heartfelt confession about choosing exploration over family, missing his daughter's childhood, prioritizing discovery over love. He expresses regret. He admits fault. When he reconnects with Liz at the end, there's genuine emotion. A father and daughter reunion after decades of absence. Doesn't this demonstrate that the film condemns Alexander's choices rather than celebrating them? In isolation, yes. The confession scene works emotionally. Caine's performance carries real remorse. The film isn't blind to the damage Alexander caused. It acknowledges the cost of his obsession. But acknowledgement isn't condemnation. Watch what the film does with Alexander's admission. It immediately forgives him. Sean doesn't struggle with anger or betrayal. He's moved by his grandfather's passion for discovery. Liz doesn't express rage at her absent father. She's relieved he's alive. The film treats Alexander's abandonment as a character flaw that's regrettable but understandable, even noble. The price of genius, the cost of pushing human knowledge forward. Compare this to how the film would treat ordinary abandonment. Imagine a version where Hank revealed he had a daughter from a previous marriage whom he hadn't seen in 5 years because he was focused on building his construction business. The film would frame this as moral failure, as a man prioritizing career over family in inexcusable ways. There's no amount of business success that would make that abandonment romantic or forgivable. But Alexander abandoned his family for decades to chase literary mythology, and it's treated as tragic romanticism. The film can't fully condemn him because condemning him means condemning the adventure ethos itself, and the film is an adventure movie. It needs you to believe, on some level, that the quest was worth it. Moreover, Alexander doesn't actually change his behavior. Yes, he admits regret, but in the final scene, he's already offering Sean the next adventure, perpetuating the exact cycle he supposedly learned was destructive. He's not retiring to spend quiet time with his daughter. He's recruiting his grandson into the lifestyle that made him abandon his family in the first place. This is performative growth. Alexander says the right words, expresses the appropriate remorse, then continues operating exactly as before. The film allows him this because it cannot imagine Alexander not being an adventurer. His identity is so fused with the quest that removing the quest would unmake the character. So the film splits the difference. Alexander acknowledges harm but doesn't change course. The lesson he learns is that family should come along on the adventure, not that adventure should be subordinated to family. That's not reformation. That's expansion of his mythology to include other people. He's still the center. The quest is still the purpose. He's just bringing everyone into his world rather than abandoning them outside it. This actually makes the ideology more insidious. Alexander doesn't have to choose between family and adventure anymore because he's convinced his family that adventure is the highest form of connection. He's colonized their value system. That's not learning a lesson, it's winning the argument. Counter-argument. 4. The film celebrates both models. It's about balance. A more sophisticated objection, I'm creating a false binary. The film isn't asking us to choose between present fathers and absent fathers. It's arguing for synthesis, combining Hank's stability with Alexander's spirit, creating a model of fatherhood that incorporates both presence and adventure. The final family unit includes both men, suggesting that children need both types of influence. This reading is textually supported. The film ends with family unity, not with one father displacing the other. Alexander and Hank aren't rivals by the end. They're collaborators. The grandfather provides vision, and the stepfather provides implementation. Together, they offer Sean a complete masculine education. But look at the power dynamics in that synthesis. Alexander is still the primary father, the one Sean idolizes, the one who shapes his values, the one who determines the next adventure. Hank is the auxiliary father, the one who enables, who protects, who handles logistics. One is the visionary, the other is the support staff. That's not balance, that's hierarchy. A genuinely balanced model would show Sean learning different lessons from each man and valuing them equally. Alexander teaches Sean to dream big and pursue impossible knowledge. Hank teaches Sean to show up consistently and value community over glory. Both lessons are treated as essential, and Sean grows into a young man who can integrate both. But the film doesn't give us that. It gives us Sean learning to value Hank for being able to do Alexander-style things, decode messages, handle crises, survive adventures. Hank isn't validated for his own qualities. He's validated for successfully imitating Alexander's qualities. That's assimilation, not integration. The film wants to believe in synthesis, but its structure won't allow it. Adventure narratives don't have a language for celebrating maintenance. They can acknowledge it, include it as necessary, even respect it functionally, but they cannot make it heroic. Heroism, in adventure's grammar, requires transcendence, and you cannot transcend by staying put. So the synthesis the film achieves is additive rather than transformative. It adds Hank to the adventure structure without transforming the structure itself. Both fathers are present at the end, but only one father's model of masculinity remains aspirational. Sean wants to be Alexander when he grows up. He wants Hank around while he does it. That's not balance. That's having your mythology and your maintenance too. Counter-argument. 5. You're ignoring the film's self-awareness. The final sophisticated objection, the film knows exactly what it's doing. The peck-popping scene, the obvious casting of the rock against type, the way Alexander is framed as slightly absurd in his obsession, these are signs of self-awareness, not unconscious ideology. The film is deliberately examining adventure father mythology, using genre conventions to critique those conventions. This is the most generous reading, and there's evidence for it. Journey 2 is more knowing than it pretends to be. Certain scenes play as commentary. The peck pop especially feels like the film winking at its own absurdity. Brad Peyton has said in interviews that he wanted to make something fun but also emotionally honest. The cast took the character dynamics seriously even as they embraced the silliness. But self-awareness doesn't equal critique. The film can be conscious of the tension between its two father figures without actually resolving that tension in favor of the present father. It can show you the trap without opening it. And that's ultimately what Journey 2 does. It diagnoses the problem adventure narratives privilege absent fathers, but cannot prescribe a solution, because the solution would require abandoning the adventure structure entirely. The film is trapped in the genre it's trying to examine, unable to step outside far enough to actually challenge its premises. Self-awareness without structural change is just sophisticated complicity. The film knows the game is rigged, but keeps playing anyway, hoping that acknowledging the rigging is enough. It's not. Hank still gets diminished. Alexander still gets elevated. The adventure still wins. The most you can say is that Journey 2 is a conflicted text, aware of its own limitations, showing you the ideological cage even as it locks you inside. That's not nothing, it's more than most family adventures attempt. But it's also not a successful critique. It's a failed revolution, a film that starts to question adventure mythology but loses its nerve halfway through and settles for conventional resolution. What these objections reveal. Here's what's interesting about all these counterarguments. They assume the film's intentions matter more than its execution, that explicit messaging overrides structural patterns, that happy endings resolve ideological contradictions, but films don't work that way. What a film says with dialogue and what it demonstrates with framing can contradict each other, and when they do, the visual language is usually telling you the truth. Journey 2 says, both fathers are valuable. It shows adventure fathers are aspirational, present fathers are functional. I'm not accusing the film of malice or even conscious bias. I'm reading what's actually on screen. The shot compositions, the narrative structure, the resolution of character arcs, the values embedded in who gets rewarded and how. And what's on screen is a film that wants to celebrate present fathers but doesn't have the narrative tools to do it, so it settles for celebrating present fathers who can perform as absent ones. The counter-arguments assume I'm being uncharitable, reading against the film's intentions, imposing a thesis the movie doesn't support. But I'm reading with the film, taking it more seriously than it's been taken, treating its choices as meaningful rather than dismissing them as just a kid's movie or just entertainment. Journey 2 is arguing with itself. The counter-arguments prove that. They're articulating what the film wants to believe about itself. What I'm showing is what the film actually demonstrates underneath its aspirations. And what it demonstrates is that we still don't know how to make adventure narratives that value staying as much as leaving, presence as much as quest, Hank as much as Alexander. The film tried. Give it credit for that. It saw the problem clearly enough to cast Dwayne Johnson as a deliberately un-rock-like stepfather, to include confession scenes and reconciliation arcs, to end with family unity rather than traditional hero triumph. But trying isn't succeeding. And the gap between the film's intentions and its execution is where the thesis lives, in the space between what Journey 2 wants to value and what its genre conventions force it to celebrate. That gap is the evidence, and it's wider than the film wants to admit. To understand why Journey 2 makes the choices it does, why it can see the problem but not solve it, you need to understand the moment it arrived in. February 2012. Post-recession America, 4 years into a crisis that wasn't just economic but existential, particularly for men whose identities had been structured around provider roles that suddenly evaporated. The film landed in a culture desperately trying to redefine masculinity, unable to let go of old models but aware the old models no longer functioned. The 2012 masculinity crisis, when provider fathers collapsed. The 2008 financial collapse didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed a specific model of fatherhood. For generations, American masculinity had organized itself around the provider role. Men proved their worth by economically sustaining their families. You didn't have to be emotionally available or physically present. You had to bring home income. That was the contract. Work justified absence. The briefcase, the commute, the late nights at the office, all validated because they funded the family's material life. Then the recession hit, and millions of men lost the jobs that justified their model of fatherhood. Unemployment spiked to 10% by October 2009. Construction, manufacturing, and finance-heavily male industries were devastated. Suddenly, fathers who'd structured their entire identities around being providers couldn't provide. The contract was void. What replaced it? American culture spent 2009-2012 scrambling for an answer. Media was saturated with think pieces about the end of men, the rise of female breadwinners, the crisis of masculine purpose. Hannah Rosin's The End of Men appeared in The Atlantic in 2010, arguing that modern economies favor female-coded skills. Kay Heimowitz published Manning Up in 2011, diagnosing extended adolescence in millennial men. The culture was asking loudly and constantly, what are men for if not providing? One answer was increased fatherly presence. If you can't be the economic hero, be the emotional one. Be involved, engaged, present for your children in ways your own father wasn't. The dad influencer wasn't yet a category in 2012, but you could see it emerging. Blogs by stay-at-home dads, articles celebrating male parenting, a slow cultural turn toward valorizing masculine domesticity. But American culture couldn't fully commit to this model because it contradicted too much inherited mythology. Adventure narratives, Western expansion stories, the rugged individual who lights out for the territories, these were the myths of American masculinity. Present fathers, domestic fathers, maintenance fathers didn't fit the heroic template. They looked like reduced versions of masculinity, men who'd settled for smaller lives because they couldn't achieve larger ones. Journey 2 arrived in this exact moment of confusion. It presents both models, Alexander the adventure father, Hank the present father, and tries to synthesize them, but it can't escape the gravitational pull of adventure mythology, so the synthesis fails. The film becomes a document of the culture's inability to imagine heroic domesticity, even as economic reality demanded it. Watch what the film does with Hank's job. He owns a construction company. This is significant. Hank isn't unemployed or struggling. He's a small business owner, an independent contractor, embodying a traditionally masculine American profession. He builds things. He employs people. He's economically productive. But the film never frames this as impressive. Sean doesn't respect his stepfather's work. Liz doesn't discuss it with pride. It's just what Hank does to fund the family's life, which is exactly the old provider-father contract. Hank is living the model that was supposed to justify masculine absence, except he's also trying to be present, and the presence doesn't register as valuable because the work isn't mythological. Alexander, by contrast, has no conventional employment. He's independently wealthy from family money. The film implies this, but never states it directly, which frees him to pursue exploration without economic justification. He doesn't work to provide, he quests for personal fulfillment. This is the luxury of inherited wealth, the ability to structure your life around adventure rather than maintenance. The film doesn't critique this class dynamic, it barely acknowledges it. But it's there, the working-class stepfather trying to prove worth through presence and labor versus the aristocratic grandfather whose wealth liberates him from having to choose between family and adventure. Alexander can have both because he's never had to work. Hank has to choose because his labor sustains others. In 2012, in recession-ravaged America, the film presents this dynamic and sides with the aristocrat. The cultural message is clear. If you have to work for money, you're already less heroic than someone who's transcended economic necessity. Jules Verne and the ideology of heroic abandonment Journey 2's foundation is Jules Verne's specifically 3 novels, Treasure Island, actually Robert Louis Stevenson, but the film conflates them, The Mysterious Island and 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. These aren't just plot sources, they're ideological sources. Verne's work codified a specific model of heroism that the film can't escape because it's adapting him. Verne's novels, written between 1863 and 1905, emerged from 19th century imperial expansion. They're about European men leaving civilization to explore, conquer, colonize, and extract resources from mysterious territories, which is to say, territories inhabited by non-Europeans whom the novels treat as primitive or absent. Captain Nemo, the genius behind the Nautilus, is explicitly fleeing civilization, choosing submarine isolation over human connection. The protagonists of The Mysterious Island are castaways who survive through ingenuity and colonial resource extraction. These novels taught generations of readers that real life happens elsewhere, that civilization is a cage, that masculinity achieves its fullest expression through departure and discovery. Home is where you return after the adventure, not where you build meaning. Women and children remain there, waiting. Men leave and become legendary. This is the ideological water Journey 2 swims in. The film is adapting Verne, which means it's inheriting Verne's value system. Adventure justifies everything. Quest creates meaning. Home is the opposite of transcendence. Sean's obsession with his grandfather is really an obsession with Vernian heroism. The belief that his grandfather's life is more meaningful than ordinary existence because it resembles a 19th century adventure novel. But here's the problem. Vernian adventure required a specific historical context that no longer exists. Those novels were possible because of imperialism, because there were blank spaces on the map. Blank only if you erase indigenous inhabitants that Europeans could explore and claim. The mysterious island could rise from the Pacific as unclaimed territory available for European exploitation. Captain Nemo could sail the oceans as a free agent answerable to no nation. That world is gone. There are no blank spaces left. Every island is claimed, every ocean is monitored, every territory is governed. The adventure father model made historical sense when there were frontiers to explore and empires to build. It makes no sense in a fully mapped, fully colonized, fully interconnected world where abandoning your family means, what? Where are you going? Why are you discovering that satellites haven't already photographed? Journey 2 tries to resurrect Vernian adventure in a post-Vernian world, and the strain shows. The mysterious island has to be impossible, literally containing creatures and geography that violate physics, because otherwise there's no justification for Alexander's decades of isolation. If it were just a regular island, his abandonment would be inexcusable. The film has to make adventure transcendent enough to retroactively justify absence, but by making the island impossible, the film also makes it unsustainable. It thinks, because the mythology it represents cannot exist in consensus reality. Vernian adventure requires a world that doesn't exist anymore. So the film has to create a pocket universe where it briefly can, then destroy that universe, because it cannot coexist with modernity. Alexander lives in the last gasp of 19th century adventure ideology. The island sinking is that ideology collapsing under its own obsolescence. And yet, the film still can't let it go, so Alexander offers the next quest, perpetuating the mythology even as its infrastructure crumbles. The Rock's persona and the impossible father Dwayne, the Rock. Johnson's casting as Hank is the film's most revealing choice. In 2012, Johnson was in the middle of reinventing himself from wrestler to action star. He'd done family comedies, The Game Plan, Race to Witch Mountain, Tooth Fairy, but was pivoting toward action franchises. Fast 5 in 2011 was his breakout. Journey 2 caught him in transition, still doing family films, but developing the indestructible action hero persona that would define his career. And the film casts him against type. Hank is not a typical Rock character. He's insecure, domesticated, deliberately made smaller. Johnson plays him with hesitation and vulnerability, constantly seeking approval from a teenager. It's a character-actor performance in a star vehicle, and it's fascinating, but it's also impossible, because Dwayne Johnson is physically incapable of not being spectacular. He's 6'5", 260 pounds of muscle, one of the most charismatic performers in Hollywood. The film wants Hank to be ordinary, but it casts someone extraordinary. So Hank becomes an ordinary man trapped in a superhero's body, which is actually a perfect metaphor for the present father's dilemma. Hank has all the physical tools of adventure heroism. He's strong, brave, capable of incredible feats. But he's trying to be a different kind of father, one who values presence over prowess, and the film and the audience can't stop seeing the Rock underneath. Every scene where Hank tries to be humble or domestic or unheroic is fighting Johnson's persona. This creates a weird tension. We know Hank could dominate any situation physically, but he chooses not to because he's trying to parent through connection rather than dominance. That should be admirable. It's literally a strong man choosing not to use his strength, modeling that masculinity doesn't have to be about physical dominance. But the film can't make that admirable within adventure framework, so it keeps putting Hank in situations where he has to use his strength anyway, fighting lizards, rescuing people, performing spectacular masculinity, because that's the only language the genre has for male heroism. The Rock's body becomes the film's prison. It cannot imagine valuing Hank without eventually requiring him to do rock-like things. Compare this to Michael Caine, who's 79 years old in this film, frail, slow-moving, physically incapable of action hero behavior. And yet Caine dominates every scene he's in through sheer iconographic weight. His adventure father model doesn't require physical prowess because it's intellectual, cultural, mythological. Alexander is heroic through knowledge and experience, not through action. This is the class and age dynamic the film can't acknowledge, the elderly British aristocrat whose heroism is cerebral versus the working-class American whose heroism has to be physical. One is allowed to age out of physical dominance while retaining respect. The other is only valuable while his body performs. In 2026, 14 years later, we've watched Dwayne Johnson become the biggest movie star in the world by leaning fully into indestructible action heroism. He abandoned the character-actor experiments and embraced spectacle. Journey 2, Hank was a road not taken, a glimpse of Johnson exploring vulnerable masculinity before deciding the market wanted something else. The culture chose Alexander over Hank too. Dad Influencers and the Mythology of Present Fatherhood, 2026. Perspective. From our vantage point in 2026, Journey 2 looks prophetic. The film anticipated a conversation about fatherhood that has consumed social media for the past several years. The rise of dad influencer culture, the ongoing debate about what men owe their children, the tension between achievement-based masculinity and presence-based fatherhood. TikTok and Instagram are now full of fathers documenting their parenting, men doing their daughters' hair, coaching Little League, sharing vulnerable moments about the challenges of modern fatherhood. These men are explicitly performing a model of masculinity based on presence and emotional availability. They're trying to be Hanks, not Alexanders. And the response has been complicated. These dad influencers are celebrated, but also mocked. Girl dad became a meme, both genuine and ironic. Men who post too much about their children are accused of performative parenting, of doing the bare minimum and expecting applause. There's a persistent cultural sense that present fathers are trying too hard, that they're overcompensating for something, that real masculinity wouldn't need to announce its domesticity. This is the same dynamic Journey 2 showed us. Hank is trying to be a present father, and the film, like the culture, doesn't quite know how to celebrate that without also requiring him to be an adventure father. Presence alone isn't enough. You have to perform presence spectacularly, turn it into content, make it legible as achievement rather than just being there. The dad influencer phenomenon proves that we still haven't solved the problem the film identified. We've created a new category of masculine performance, Instagram-ready fatherhood. But we haven't actually changed the underlying structure, fatherhood, as performance requiring validation. Present fathers still have to justify their choice to stay, still have to prove that domesticity is as valuable as departure. Meanwhile, adventure father mythology persists in different forms. Tech billionaires shooting themselves into space, crypto bros exploring digital frontiers, podcasters celebrating masculine sovereignty and freedom. The Vernian adventure father just rebranded. He's still choosing mission over maintenance, still treating family as the thing you return to between quests, still structuring masculinity around transcendence rather than connection. Alexander's final gift to Sean, another Verne novel, another set of coordinates, another adventure, is still the cultural template. We're teaching boys that real life happens elsewhere, that staying is settling, that the heroes are the ones who leave. Journey 2 tried to argue against this, failed, but tried, which is more than most contemporary media attempts. the adventure genre's structural trap. Here's the deepest context. Journey 2 cannot succeed at its implicit critique because it's an adventure film critiquing adventure. It's trying to use genre conventions to argue against those conventions, and the conventions win every time. Adventure narratives have been structured the same way for centuries: departure from home, trials in foreign space, return transformed. The hero's journey, the monomyth, the quest structure, all of these require leaving. They cannot imagine heroism that stays put. Maintenance, care, presence, these are not adventure. They're what you escape from to have adventure. Every adventure film ever made teaches children that home is boring and elsewhere is exciting, that parents who say stay are obstacles and strangers who say come are guides, that ordinary life is a cage and departure is freedom. This isn't subtext, it's the overt structure of the genre. Journey 2 is trapped inside this structure. It casts The Rock as a present father and Michael Caine as an absent one, clearly trying to reverse the usual values. But then it has to be an adventure film, which means it has to leave home, enter mythological space, and reward departure. The genre conventions override the casting choices. You can see the film trying to escape. The island sinks? Maybe that's the film killing adventure, showing its unsustainability. But then Alexander offers the next quest adventure, survives its physical destruction. The film wants to critique the genre, but also wants to be the genre, and those desires are incompatible. This is why so few adventure narratives successfully critique adventure. The ones that try, like Apocalypse Now or There Will Be Blood, have to become horror films. They have to show adventure as pathology, as madness, as destruction. They have to completely evacuate the romance from the quest to make you see its cost. Journey 2 isn't willing to do that. It's a family film, rated PG, designed to make children excited about adventure. It cannot fully commit to showing adventure as ideology that destroys families, because then it wouldn't be fun anymore. So it splits the difference, shows you the problem, then resolves it conventionally, hoping you don't notice the contradiction. The result is a film at war with itself, aware enough to diagnose the issue, not free enough to prescribe the cure. It's a movie that wants to celebrate present fathers but can only imagine doing so by turning them into absent ones. That's not a failure of imagination, it's a structural inevitability, the genre eating its own critique. What Journey 2 shows us about ourselves. Ultimately, the context that matters most is us, the audience, the culture that made this film possible and then forgot about it. We say we value present fathers. We say we want men to be emotionally available, domestically engaged, actively involved in their children's lives. We say the provider-father model is obsolete, that mere economic contribution isn't enough, that modern fatherhood requires presence. But then we make films like Journey 2, where the present father has to prove his worth by becoming an adventure father, where the absent grandfather is forgiven immediately because his quest was interesting, where the mythology of departure remains more compelling than the reality of staying. We say we've evolved past Vernian adventure ideology, but we're still teaching our children through story structures that the heroes are the ones who leave. We still frame adventure as transcendence and domesticity as limitation. We still make Michael Caine the magnetic presence and Dwayne Johnson the one who has to try too hard. The film is a mirror. It shows us what we claim to believe versus what our narratives actually celebrate. And the gap between those things is where the ideology lives, in the space between our stated values and our structural preferences, between what we say fathers should be and what we make heroic in our stories. Journey 2 failed to resolve this contradiction. But 14 years later, in 2026, neither have we. We're still telling boys that real men leave for something greater. Still teaching girls that fathers who stay are less fascinating than fathers who go. still structuring our adventure narratives around departure as the ultimate masculine expression. And we're still wondering why men struggle with domesticity, why fatherhood is in crisis, why we can't seem to imagine heroic maintenance. The island keeps sinking. And we keep offering the next adventure because we don't know how to tell a story where staying is the victory. Journey 2 saw the trap, showed it to us clearly, lit it beautifully, made the bars visible, then locked us inside anyway. Because it didn't know how to do anything else. Neither do we. The thesis isn't just in the script, it's embedded in every technical choice the film makes. Director Brad Peyton, cinematographer David Tattersall, editor David Rennie, and composer Andrew Lockington aren't just telling a story. They're using film grammar to teach you which father to value, which masculinity to aspire to, which model of heroism deserves your attention. Let me show you how craft becomes argument. Cinematography, the visual hierarchy of fathers. David Tattersall shot this film, and his previous credits are revealing he'd worked with Brad Peyton on Cats and Dogs, The Revenge of Kitty Galore, but before that, he'd been a major cinematographer on prestige projects. His visual language here isn't accidental, it's ideological. Watch how the film lights its two father figures. Alexander is consistently shot in warm, golden tones whenever he's in adventure space. The island sequences bathe him in magic hour light, that soft, directional glow that photographers chase because it makes everything look mythological. When Caine stands in front of his camp explaining Vernean geography, he's backlit by late afternoon sun filtering through impossible foliage, creating a literal halo effect. The film is deifying him through lighting. Hank, by contrast, is lit practically. In mainland scenes, he gets flat overhead lighting, the fluorescent institutional wash of police stations and suburban homes. Even on the island, Hank is rarely given the golden treatment. He's lit with harder, more neutral light that reads as realistic rather than romantic. The film's lighting scheme tells you Alexander exists in mythological space. Hank exists in mundane space. This continues into shot composition. Count how many times Alexander is given low-angle shots versus Hank. Low angles grant authority, make subjects appear larger and more significant. The camera tilts up to Alexander constantly when he's explaining the island's secrets, when he's standing in front of the Nautilus, when he's delivering wisdom to Sean. These aren't dramatic low angles, but subtle tilts that accumulate psychologically. You're literally looking up to Alexander. Hank gets eye-level shots, occasionally high angles, when he's trying to parent Sean, when he's expressing concern, when he's being practical. The camera is level with him or above him. He's not granted visual authority. The framing makes him accessible, relatable, ordinary, which would be fine if the film were celebrating ordinariness, but it's not. It's celebrating mythology. The most revealing compositional choice happens in group shots. When Alexander, Hank, and Sean are in the same frame, watch where the focus is. Tattersall consistently uses depth of field to privilege Alexander, keeping him sharp, while Hank softens into background, or splitting focus between Alexander and Sean, while Hank remains out of focus entirely. The camera literally cannot see Hank clearly when Alexander is present. This is how cinematography makes arguments, not through overt symbolism, but through accumulated visual decisions that train your eye where to look, who to privilege, whose presence matters. The film is telling you through focal length and light quality that one father is transcendent and the other is functional. Even the camera movement differs. Alexander gets static, contemplative shots, long takes where the camera rests, allowing you to absorb his presence. Hank gets more dynamic framing. The camera moves with him, around him, tracking his activity. Static camera creates gravitas. Moving camera creates energy. One approach suggests wisdom worth contemplating. The other suggests activity worth following. Guess which father gets which treatment? Editing, whose knowledge gets screen time. David Rennie's editing choices construct a hierarchy of value that dialogue can't override. Watch the code-breaking sequence where Hank solves the encryption that stumped Sean for months. By narrative logic, this should be Hank's hero moment. the stepfather proving his competence, demonstrating that his military experience gives him knowledge the teenager lacks. Here's what Rennie does. He cuts away. Hank identifies the code type, starts working on the decryption, and the film cuts to Sean watching, then cuts to the result. We don't see Hank's process. We don't watch his hands on the keyboard or his face concentrating or the moment of breakthrough. The actual labor of solving the puzzle is elided, treated as mechanical rather than intellectual. Contrast this with every scene where Alexander explains Vernian connections. When the grandfather reveals that 3 fictional islands occupy the same coordinates, Rennie gives us a full montage. Alexander pulling out old charts, tracing calculations, explaining the literary evidence. The camera lingers on his hands, touching ancient paper. We see his thought process made visible. The editing grants his intellectual work screen time and visual interest. This is editing as value judgment. Hank's knowledge is treated as utility. It produces a result, but the result is what matters, not the process. Alexander's knowledge is treated as wisdom. The process is the result, and we're invited to witness it. The pattern repeats throughout the film. When Hank is repairing the Nautilus, we get quick cuts. Hank working, sparks flying, progress happening. It's montage language, the visual shorthand for time passing, work being done. When Alexander is identifying creatures or explaining island geology, we get sustained takes, the camera resting on Caine's face as he speaks, granting his exposition the weight of revelation. Rennie also makes interesting choices about reaction shots. After Hank does something competent, solves the code, pilots the helicopter, repairs the submarine, the film cuts to Sean's reaction, which is usually mild appreciation or immediate refocusing on the next problem. The stepson's validation is withheld or minimized through editing. After Alexander does something impressive, reveals hidden knowledge, makes a Vernian connection, demonstrates survival skills, we get extended reaction shots of Sean looking awed, admiring, transformed. Rennie holds on Josh Hutcherson's face, letting you see the grandfather's effect on the grandson. The editing is telling you, this is the relationship that matters. This is the knowledge transfer that's significant. There's also the micro-editing of conversations. When Hank is speaking, especially when he's trying to be practical or cautious, Rennie cuts him off. Not completely, but through interruptive cutting, someone else starts talking, or we cut away to action, or the scene transitions before Hank finishes his thought. His dialogue gets fragmented, treated as less essential than what's happening around it. Alexander's speeches are protected. When Caine delivers exposition or wisdom, the editing creates space for it. Other characters stop, listen, and the camera stays with him until he's finished. His words are treated as important enough to let breathe. Hank's words are treated as functional, convey information quickly, then move on. This accumulates over 90 minutes. You don't consciously notice that one father gets sustained takes and the other gets fragmented coverage, but your brain registers it, learns from it, understands at a subconscious level which father the film privileges. Performance direction, what the actors were asked to do. Watch what Peyton gets from his 2 leads. Michael Caine is playing Michael Caine. The performance is continuous with his entire career. The same clipped British diction, the same authoritative calm, the same twinkling intelligence. Caine isn't transforming into Alexander, he's being himself, which is Alexander. The character is written to match the persona. This is brilliant casting because it means Alexander arrives pre-mythologized. You cannot watch Michael Caine without activating decades of associations. Harry Palmer, Alfie, every spy and mentor and British gentleman he's played. The film doesn't have to build Alexander's legendary status. It just has to cast Caine, and his iconography does the work. Now watch what Dwayne Johnson is doing. He's actively fighting his persona, making himself smaller, less confident, more uncertain. Johnson's natural charisma is being deliberately suppressed. Watch his body language in early scenes, hunched shoulders, hesitant gestures, seeking approval. This is the Rock playing against type, trying to inhabit ordinariness. It's a generous performance. Johnson is allowing himself to be diminished so the character can read as a regular guy struggling with stepfatherhood. But it creates a problem. We can see him performing smallness, which means we're aware of the largeness he's suppressing. Hank becomes a strong man choosing to be weak, which should be noble but reads as diminishment because the film's adventure structure values strength. Peyton directed Johnson to be vulnerable, but he directed the film to reward confidence. So Johnson's performance is constantly working against the film's genre conventions. When Hank finally does action hero things in the third act, Johnson visibly relaxes into his natural persona, and suddenly he commands the screen. The film comes alive when Hank stops trying to be an ordinary stepfather and starts being the Rock. This proves the thesis through performance. Hank is most valued when he stops performing presence and starts performing adventure. Johnson's best moments are when he's doing what Johnson does best: physical heroism, charismatic action, spectacular masculinity. His worst moments in terms of screen effectiveness are when he's trying to be domestically vulnerable. The film can't help itself. It cast a superhero to play an ordinary man, then kept creating situations where the superhero had to emerge. That's not a performance failure. It's the genre reasserting itself against the film's stated intentions. Josh Hutcherson is directed to play admiration differently depending on which father he's interacting with. With Hank, his performance is guarded arms crossed, minimal eye contact, body language that reads as tolerance rather than enthusiasm. With Alexander, he opens up, leaning forward, face mobile, eyes bright. Peyton is directing him to physically demonstrate which relationship engages him. This is subtle performance direction that reinforces the hierarchy. Sean is most alive around his grandfather, most closed around his stepfather. The actors are using their bodies to tell you who matters to the protagonist. Sound design and score. The sonic value system. Andrew Lockington's score makes constant judgments about which father gets musical support, adventure themes, orchestral swells, heroic brass. The sonic language of wonder accompany Alexander almost exclusively. When the grandfather is explaining Vernian connections or revealing island secrets, the score treats him like Indiana Jones discovering the Ark. Hank gets different musical treatment. In domestic scenes, he gets neutral scoring or silence. When he's being practical, the music drops out, letting his words exist in flat acoustic space. Only when Hank is doing adventure hero things, fighting creatures, piloting vehicles, performing spectacular masculinity, does he get the full orchestral treatment. The score is teaching you that certain behaviors deserve musical validation and others don't. Practical fatherhood gets silence. Mythological fatherhood gets themes. Listen to the sound design in the code-breaking scene. When Hank is working on decryption, we hear realistic keyboard clicks, neutral room tone, diegetic sound that grounds the moment in mundane reality. When Alexander is explaining literary connections, we get subtle underscore, ambient island sounds mixed for beauty, a sonic environment that elevates the moment beyond realism. Sound design is creating two different sonic worlds. Hank exists in acoustic realism. Alexander exists in sonic mythology. One is grounded, the other is elevated. The film is telling you through audio which world is more valuable. The most interesting sonic choice is the peck-popping scene. When Hank bounces his pectorals, the sound design adds comical enhancement, exaggerated muscle sounds, almost cartoonish audio. This is the film mocking Hank through sound, making his desperate masculine display into a joke. Compare this to how Alexander's actions are scored seriously, without ironic distance. The sound design is editorializing, using audio to create tone that undermines Hank even as the plot requires him to succeed. He achieves the goal, distracts the lizard, but the sonic treatment makes him ridiculous in achieving it. Production design, home versus adventure. The film's production design creates a visual argument about which spaces have value. Every mainland location, Sean's house, the police station, the helicopter office in Palau is designed for functional realism. These spaces are boring by design, deliberately uncinematic, communicating that ordinary life is visually impoverished. The island, by contrast, is production design as fantasy fulfillment. Giant mushrooms, impossible geology, CGI creatures that exist purely for visual wonder. Production designer Bill Bowes created an environment that justifies adventure, that makes Alexander's choice to stay there comprehensible because who wouldn't want to live in a world this visually rich? This is ideological production design. By making home spaces boring and adventure spaces spectacular, the film is arguing through environment that departure is correct. Hank wants Sean to stay in visually impoverished domesticity. Alexander offers visually rich adventure. The choice is made before anyone speaks. Even Alexander's camp on the island is designed to look cool, salvaged materials arranged with aesthetic care. A life of privation that somehow looks romantic. It's Robinson Crusoe filtered through prestige cinematography, poverty that reads as resourcefulness rather than suffering. Hank, by contrast, has no visual identity in his home environment. We barely see where he lives, how he's decorated, what his domestic space reveals about him. He's defined by function, not by aesthetic. Alexander is defined by his environment. Hank disappears into his. The 3D gimmick, Spectacle as Validation Journey 2, was shot in 3D, and this isn't incidental to the thesis. The 3D effects are consistently used to make adventure spectacular creatures coming at the camera, depth in island landscapes, visual tricks that reward exploration. Domesticity gets no 3D enhancement. The technological spectacle is reserved exclusively for adventure space. This was a commercial decision. 3D justified higher ticket prices, but it became a thematic one. The film is literally adding dimension to adventure while leaving domesticity flat. You watch the mainland scenes in effective 2D and the island scenes in immersive 3D, and the technology is teaching you which world is richer, more real, more worthy of your visual attention. The peck-popping scene uses 3D for comedy. Hank's chest coming at the camera in exaggerated depth. It's a gimmick shot, the kind 3D enables, and it makes Hank's body into a joke. Alexander's knowledge, by contrast, gets no comedic 3D treatment. His wisdom isn't made into spectacle. Technology itself is serving the thesis. The most advanced filmmaking tools are deployed to make adventure look superior to domesticity, to make Alexander's world more visually rewarding than Hank's. What the craft reveals. Every technical choice reinforces the hierarchy the script tries to complicate. Peyton may have wanted to celebrate present fatherhood, but his cinematographer lit Michael Caine like a deity. The screenplay may position both fathers as valuable, but the editor gives Caine's exposition more screen time. The score may play during Hank's action scenes, but it treats them as functional rather than transcendent. This is how ideology works in cinema, not through overt messaging, but through accumulated craft decisions that train your eye, your ear, your attention. You don't consciously think the film values Alexander more. You just watch Alexander's scenes with more engagement, remember his dialogue more clearly, feel his absence more acutely. The craft is the argument. Tattersall's camera, Rennie's cuts, Lockington's score, Boaz's design, they're all making the case that adventure fathers deserve more visual, sonic, and temporal attention than present fathers. Journey 2's craft is extraordinary in one sense. It's so consistent in its privileging that it becomes evidence. The film cannot help showing you which father it values because every department chose the same answer. That answer is Alexander. Every time. So rewatch it, not as disposable family entertainment, but as a cultural document about what we actually value in fathers versus what we claim to value. Watch how every frame, every cut, every musical cue tells you that the man who left is more fascinating than the man who stayed. Watch how a film that desperately wants to celebrate present fatherhood cannot escape the gravitational pull of adventure mythology. Watch how it tries to synthesize two models of masculinity and fails, leaving us with the same hierarchy we started with, just better disguised. Journey 2. The Mysterious Island isn't a bad film that accidentally reveals ideological problems. It's an honest film that shows you problems the culture doesn't want to acknowledge. The difference matters. What this reading actually claims. Let me be precise about the argument, because precision is how we avoid dismissal. I'm not claiming Journey 2 is secretly sophisticated or that Brad Peyton is a misunderstood auteur critiquing adventure cinema from within. I'm claiming the film is a battleground where competing ideas about fatherhood fought to a draw, and the evidence of that battle is visible in every contradiction between what the film wants to say and what its structure forces it to demonstrate. The thesis is this: we've built a century of narrative infrastructure around the idea that fathers are most valuable when they're pursuing something more important than their family. Adventure stories from Jules Verne forward have taught us that real heroism requires departure, that meaningful masculinity happens elsewhere, that staying is settling. Journey 2 arrived in a cultural moment, 2012, post-recession masculinity crisis, when that model was visibly failing, when economic reality had destroyed the provider father and we needed a new model. The film cast Dwayne Johnson as a present father and Michael Caine as an absent adventurer, specifically to argue that the former deserves more respect than the latter. But the film is an adventure movie, which means it's built from the same narrative DNA it's trying to critique. So every attempt to elevate the present father gets undermined by genre conventions that privilege adventure. The cinematography makes Alexander mythological and Hank ordinary. The editing gives Alexander's knowledge more screen time than Hank's competence. The score treats Alexander's exposition as wisdom and Hank's labor as function. The resolution requires Hank to prove his worth by becoming adventurous, rather than Sean learning that presence has different, equally valid value. The film ends with both fathers included in the family, which looks like synthesis. But look at the power dynamics. Alexander still offers the next quest, still shapes Sean's future, still occupies the aspirational position. Hank has been admitted to the family structure, but not at the top. He's the auxiliary father, the support system for Sean's real relationship, which is with adventure itself, embodied by Alexander. This isn't a story about reconciliation. It's a story about assimilation. Hank doesn't change the family's value system, he learns to operate within it. The present father model doesn't displace the adventure father model, it subordinates itself to it. That's the argument. Not hidden, not subtle, not reading against the text reading. With the text, taking its craft choices seriously, treating its contradictions as evidence rather than errors. What we gain from this interpretation. Why does this reading matter? Because it explains something the obvious reading doesn't. Why the film feels unsatisfying despite delivering its promised emotional beats. Critics dismissed Journey 2 as forgettable, and audiences agreed it made money but left no cultural footprint. The standard explanation is that it's just mediocre family entertainment, competently made but unremarkable. But that doesn't explain why it's unremarkable. Plenty of mediocre family films become beloved through charm or spectacle or emotional truth. Journey 2 has all three. The Rock's charisma, impressive CGI, genuine father-son moments, yet it evaporates from memory. This reading explains why the film is working against itself. Every emotional beat it tries to earn is undermined by structural choices that contradict the stated message. You're supposed to feel satisfied when Sean accepts Hank, but you've spent 90 minutes watching the film visually and sonically privilege Alexander. You're supposed to believe both fathers are valuable, but every craft decision has told you one is mythological and the other is functional. The emotional resolution doesn't match the visual evidence. This creates cognitive dissonance that registers as forgettability. The film doesn't cohere because it's arguing with itself, and audiences sense the incoherence even if they can't articulate it. So they shrug, say it was fine, and never think about it again. But the incoherence is the point. It's evidence of a culture that doesn't know how to value present fathers, that wants to evolve beyond adventure father mythology, but cannot imagine heroism outside that framework. Journey 2 is disposable not because it's poorly made, but because it's honestly made. It shows you the contradictions we'd rather ignore. This interpretation also explains the peck-popping scene's cultural afterlife. That moment became a meme, widely mocked, cited as evidence of the film's stupidity. But memes are interesting. We remember and repeat the things that make us uncomfortable, that violate expectations in revealing ways. The peck pop is funny, yes. It's also a stepfather debasing himself to compete with an absent grandfather's effortless mystique, his body becoming a circus act because presence alone isn't spectacular enough. We laugh because acknowledging what that scene actually shows would be too painful. It would require admitting that we've structured fatherhood as a competition where present fathers start at a disadvantage, where they have to perform increasingly degrading versions of masculinity to earn the respect that absent fathers receive automatically. Easier to make it a meme, easier to mock The Rock for doing something silly than to ask why the film required him to do it. This reading gives you tools to see what the culture is hiding in plain sight. We say we value present fathers, but our stories still teach children to worship absent ones. We say masculinity should be redefined around care and presence, but our adventure narratives still make heroes out of men who leave. Journey 2 tried to bridge that gap and couldn't, and the failure is more instructive than success would have been. What it reveals about us. Here's what makes this reading uncomfortable. It's not really about Journey 2. The film is just the most honest example of a pattern that's everywhere. Look at contemporary fatherhood films. How many actually celebrate maintenance labor? How many show fathers being heroic through consistency rather than through crisis? Even films explicitly about present fatherhood, like Finding Nemo or The Pursuit of Happiness, structure themselves around extraordinary circumstances. The father has to go on a literal ocean-crossing quest or survive homelessness to prove his devotion. Ordinary presence, daily showing up, unglamorous consistency, these never get the movie treatment. We cannot make ordinary fatherhood cinematic without extraordinary circumstances. That's the confession embedded in every family film. Stable, present, consistent fatherhood is too boring for narrative. It has to be disrupted, threatened, or tested through adventure before it becomes worthy of storytelling. This is what Journey 2 reveals about us. We're still Vernian. We still believe, at a structural level, that meaningful life happens elsewhere. Home is what you escape from or return to, not where you build heroism. Fathers who stay are supporting characters in stories about fathers who leave. Think about the dad influencer phenomenon discussed earlier. Why does present fatherhood have to become performative, documented, turned into content before it registers as valuable? Because presence alone doesn't generate narrative. A father making breakfast every morning for 18 years isn't a story. A father documenting himself making breakfast and posting it to TikTok with a caption about modern masculinity, that's a story. Because it's performance, because it's spectacular. We've taken Hank's model and made it require Alexander's approach. You can be a present father, but you have to make it adventurous, make it content, make it into something other than just being there. Journey 2 shows you this pattern operating at the level of film craft. Hank can be present, but he's only visually interesting when he's performing spectacle. Alexander can be absent for decades, but he's visually fascinating just standing still. The camera loves him. It tolerates Hank. That's us. That's what we've built. A culture where fatherly presence is the price of admission, not the achievement itself. Where men have to justify staying by doing it adventurously, by turning domesticity into content, by being present in spectacular rather than ordinary ways. And we've taught this to children through 100 films like Journey 2, where the present father eventually gets accepted, but the absent father gets revered, where reconciliation happens on the adventurer's terms, never on the maintainer's, where the final scene shows unity, but the final gift is another quest, another journey, another reason to leave. The sinking island as prophecy returned to the central metaphor. The mysterious island rises every 70 years, offers impossible wonders, then sinks back into the ocean. Alexander has lived there for years, but it cannot sustain human life permanently. It's beautiful, spectacular, worth visiting, but you cannot build there. Anyone who tries will drown when it inevitably collapses. This is the film telling you that adventure father mythology is unsustainable. You can visit that model, can borrow from it temporarily, but you cannot structure a life around it. The ground will give way. The island will sink. In 2012, the film showed you that collapse happening. The recession had already demonstrated that provider-father models don't work when economies fail. Journey 2 shows you that adventure-father models don't work either. They're literally built on sinking ground. But then Alexander offers another Jules Verne novel, another set of coordinates, another island that will rise and sink. The mythology survives the collapse of its physical infrastructure. This is how ideologies persist, not by being true, but by being renewable. Each generation gets a new island, a new adventure, a new justification for choosing quest over presence. From 2026, 14 years later, we can see how right the film was. The island has sunk several more times. Every few years, there's a new crisis in masculinity, a new conversation about what men owe their families, a new attempt to redefine fatherhood. And every time we rebuild the same structure, adventure is transcendent, presence is functional, real men are pursuing something more important than domesticity. Tech billionaires going to Mars, crypto entrepreneurs exploring digital frontiers, pickup artists and podcasters celebrating masculine sovereignty, teaching men that commitment is a trap. These are just Alexander in new clothes, offering the same Vernian ideology. Real life happens elsewhere, and the men who stay are settling. The island keeps sinking. We keep rebuilding it. Because we don't have a different architecture. We don't know how to construct heroic masculinity that stays put. Journey 2 showed you this. Not through dialogue or plot, but through structure, through the way it tried to celebrate Hank and couldn't, through the way it wanted to critique Alexander and couldn't, through the way it ended with apparent synthesis that was actually hierarchy. The film is prophecy disguised as entertainment. It predicted our inability to solve this problem, our tendency to default to adventure mythology even when we know it's failing, our commitment to teaching children the same lies about fatherhood that damaged us. What you'll see on Rewatch, so go back, watch it again with this lens. You'll see different film. Watch the opening scene where Hank arrives at the police station at 2 a.m. to bail out his stepson. Notice that Sean doesn't say thank you. Notice that Hank's exhaustion is treated as the baseline expectation of present fathers. You show up, you handle it, you don't get credit. Watch the code-breaking scene and notice how quickly the film moves past Hank's competence. Count the seconds. Compare it to how long the film lingers on Alexander's explanations of Vernian coordinates. Watch every group shot and notice where the focus is. Notice which father the camera can see clearly and which one softens into background. Watch the peck-popping scene and don't laugh. Watch Dwayne Johnson's face as he performs this degrading spectacle to stay relevant in his stepson's eyes. Watch a good man realize that being good isn't enough if you're not mythological. Watch Alexander admit he abandoned his family and notice how quickly everyone forgives him. Notice that the cost of his adventure, Liz growing up without a father, Sean growing up without a grandfather, is acknowledged but never treated as disqualifying. Watch the island sink and notice that this should be the moment where adventure mythology dies. Then watch Alexander offer the next quest and notice that the mythology survives its physical destruction. Watch the final frame and notice the composition. Notice who's leaning toward whom, which relationship commands the visual center, where Hank is positioned in the family geometry. You'll see a different film. Not a better or worse one, but an honest one. A film that tried to challenge adventure mythology and got trapped inside it. A film that wanted to celebrate present fathers but only knew how to celebrate spectacular ones. You'll see us. You'll see what we value when we're not paying attention, when we're just making a family movie and letting our unconscious ideology slip through in the craft choices. The challenge. Here's what I'm asking you to do. Stop letting adventure narratives off the hook. Stop accepting that departure is heroic and presence is ordinary. Stop teaching children through story structure that real life happens elsewhere. Journey 2 couldn't solve this problem because it was trapped inside genre conventions. You're not. You can watch critically, can see the ideology operating, can choose to reject the lessons embedded in craft choices. The next time you watch a film where a father has to go on an adventure to prove his worth, ask why. Why can't he be heroic through presence? Why does showing up daily for 18 years count for less than one spectacular quest? Why do we need extraordinary circumstances to make ordinary fatherhood visible? The next time someone dismisses a dad influencer as performative, ask what non-performative present fatherhood would look like in a culture that only recognizes spectacular masculinity. Ask why men have to document their domesticity for it to register as valuable. The next time you're told a film is just entertainment, remember that entertainment is where ideology lives. The stories we don't take seriously are the ones that shape us most effectively, precisely because we let them bypass our critical faculties. Journey 2 is just entertainment. That's why it matters. It shows you the cage we're living in. The adventure structures that make it impossible to imagine heroic maintenance, the visual grammar that makes presence ordinary and quest mythological, the scoring choices that give music to departure and silence to staying. The island is always sinking. We keep rebuilding it, and we keep telling boys that real men are the ones who board the ship before it goes down, heading for the next adventure, leaving the maintenance fathers to handle the consequences. This film tried to argue against that. Failed, but tried. Your turn. Stop celebrating fathers who leave for important quests. Start celebrating fathers who stay for unimportant Tuesdays. Stop making children decode absent fathers' coordinates. Start teaching them that the man at the police station at 2 a.m. is the hero. Rewatch Journey 2. See what it's actually showing you. Then demand different stories.